Whether it's for Dungeons and Dragons or for your own world building and stories, creating convincing and interesting factions is an important part of that process. On this channel, we have learned how to build better characters using the color pie. So today, I want to follow that up by learning how to best use the color pie to craft more dynamic factions, as well as discuss a system that even the most seasoned DMs can use to surprise themselves with a faction they never expected to build. For us to form a basis for this process, we will go through each of the 5 colors and discuss the kinds of factions you will find in each one. And to further aid your process, I will lay out 2 versions of each. One which has noble motivations, and then the other side of it, in how these colors can take on a more sinister approach to achieving their goals. I know on this channel we've talked a lot about the 5 colors, and how they illuminate the philosophies of the individual, but something different happens when those same motivations are applied to larger groups. Once we have touched on both versions of each color though, I want to talk about how you can turn these concepts into tools you can use to build a faction of your own. Now, I want to begin by painting a picture of a benevolent white faction, before we flip it on its head and craft a sinister one. The primary goal of a white faction is to be the antithesis of chaos. They would build their membership around people who stand for order and wish to bring peace to the world. A group with a strong moral compass and a respect for rigid rules. What first comes to my mind is a knightly order, devoted monks, or pious paladins. They would value those who are selfless and disciplined, ones willing to forego their own identity in favor of unity under a single banner. You would see a lot of pageantry, rituals, and similar adornments within this group, as their identity is based on being a core unit with an identifiable and clear goal. You would know when this group comes into town, and those with nothing to hide would welcome their arrival. With gleaming armor and raised banners, this group would march as one, and would be a faction that was known throughout the land. They would make a name for themselves by capturing dangerous criminals, slaying vile demons, or fighting for the weak. When building this faction, keep in mind these core points. They must have a strong visual identity, a rigid code of honor, and a selfless attitude, in that their identity is based on the faction and not the individual. Next, let's discuss the flip side. Say you want to build a villainous white faction. The primary goal of a villainous white faction is to enforce its skewed moral code upon the masses. So instead of upholding order through honor, they uphold order through oppression. They would have an outlook on life that is not reasonable to live under for the common person. What I mean is that they would create their own rigid moral system, one that only functions to harm the masses instead of healing them. The types of factions within this version of white would be a fanatic religious group, an oppressive government, or a vigilante group that brutally punishes those it deems the enemy. This kind of faction is like a heavy hand on the people, always pressing down, squeezing the life from each one, either through ruthless punishments or heavy taxes. One thing that makes this type of evil faction so dangerous is that they often believe they're doing these actions for the betterment of those who are oppressed, whether they believe their god demands these actions or that their government is what these people deserve. The goal of this group is to stop chaos, even if that means crushing the human spirit. When building these factions, keep in mind these core ideas. They will be guided by a skewed moral compass. Their reach is as far as they can manage, and their own view of themselves is often more noble than the view the oppressed have of them. Learning, discovery, and perfection are at the heart of Blue, and so it's no surprise that factions under this banner would focus on these core ideals as their primary goal. How the benevolent versus the sinister version take on this goal is what defines them. The good version of the blue faction would be one who focuses on learning to create a better world. This can take many forms. The first that comes to my mind is of a school of magic, one that helps mages refine their skills, and in turn, go back out into the world to help others. They may venture far from each other, and yet will always be unified under the banner of the school that taught them. Thus, the school's reputation would always precede them. This school would keep them on the right path, teaching restraint instead of exploitation. Another way we might see blue form a faction is in the creation of a Artificers Guild, a group of people who take the concept of building a better world quite literally. Each member would contribute to each other's success and would set up an environment of support and discovery, putting their combined efforts to great use, crafting grand projects like interplanar portals, water treatment plants, or anti-dragon containment fields. The structure of this type of faction is less important than its unifying goal. A benevolent blue faction is one that wants to gather like-minded people to better themselves in the world around them. When building this kind of blue faction, keep in mind these things. The world always has room to improve. We can become better through sharing knowledge, and that one person's discovery can lead to another. And so, cooperation is key. The other face of the coin is a blue faction that takes the perfecting of society too far. They have a colder view of humanity and believe that they hold the key to humanity's future, as the simple people that inhabit the plane aren't smart enough to know what is good for them in the long run. This faction might pull the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating the course of history in a way that suits them. It doesn't always have to be so far-reaching though. It can take the form of a smaller faction. Perhaps it would be a group of scientists who feel they have found a better form for humanity and experiment on the population to achieve this new evolution, whether the people want to change or not. They're still drawn together into this faction for the same reason as before though, as progress and discovery are stronger in a group of like-minded people. It's just that their true goal does not align with the rest of humanity, but they care little for fools. In a way, it's an elitist view, an entitlement through intelligence. When building this sort of blue faction, be sure to note these key traits. Your faction must have a goal in mind that is an impossible dream, one that drives them to take drastic measures on an unwilling population. Just be sure when building this faction that you aim for the stars, and if the road to that goal is paved in blood, then you know you're on the right track. Now we come to black. This time around I want to start with the side that you expect, and first cover the darker factions found within this color. The goal of a faction under this version of black is focused on power at any cost. It may find power in the streets, behind manor walls, or in haunted catacombs. Ones who make things happen within the underbelly of any city, but whose influence is still felt in the pockets of the High Court. On the other hand, the black faction might take the form of a cult whose sole purpose is to bring back an old force into this world, with the goal of harnessing a forbidden magic. Imagine your player's party walking into a town. Strange markings can be found throughout, and the whispers of a cult growing in numbers is overheard. This faction manages to pull a demon straight from the pits of hell, and in turn, this beast gives them the power they seek, thus creating a guild whose magic stems from a true demonic source. Whichever way you go, the key to this version of a black faction is this phrase: power at any cost. So when building your evil black faction, the goal is clear: power and control over all. How they go about it will define your evil black faction. For the interesting part, I want to flip black on its head now and remove our previous motto and replace it with a new version of the black faction. One that does not seek power, but instead uplifts the individual or gets its hands dirty for the sake of others. One of the key focuses for black is self, and yet there is room to lift others up who are on the same path. In this way, I envision that a black faction like this would take in strong-willed people and mold them to be great leaders, generals, or hardened warriors. In another way, it could be a group whose goal is to allow for the freedom of the individual, and one who lashes out against outside pressures that would aim to oppress them. In another fashion, black is the one color willing to do whatever it takes. And in that way, a good black faction might also resemble an assassin's guild, one that kills those whose life is a burden on others. They would target slavers, corrupted politicians, and others who wish to oppress or exploit. Often when we think of black factions, we picture the version I discussed previously, and yet we can have a lot more fun creating black factions that skirt the line of being good. The key for this side of black is empowering the individual, whether that is in the lifting up of like-minded individuals, or by crushing those who would exploit that individual. I think you can have a lot of fun building red factions, as they will usually be loosely formed and yet tightly knit by loyalty, which will be a strong factor when building red factions. Let's begin with the positive red faction first. Like I said, loyalty is a strong force that holds any red faction together, and in the case of this version, those ties are strongest. Red often gets conflated with violence because Magic is a game centered on combat. But remember, red is the color of emotion, and things like loyalty, empathy, and love can be just as present as any other emotion. In this regard, a red faction might be one that brings together outcasts, those whom society has discarded and who want to be part of a new family, with the only prerequisite being that you must have been cast out, and you must adopt this group as your own. Of course, a group like this couldn't help themselves and would get into some sort of mischief, or would rebel against those who had discarded them, but it wouldn't be their primary goal. Their goal would be to bring in others and help them feel at home in a world that does not care for them. Of course, anger is a valid feeling too, especially when you've been tossed aside, so do not forget those that put you there. They deserve a black eye in return for the one they gave you. Because of this, red could also become a rebel group who fights against the rigid structures of class and oppression. Red can be anarchy for sure, but anarchy in a way that sets each person free and allows no one to be above the other. On the flip side, red can just as much be about anger, violence, frustration. It can be a group held together by a common hatred, or a desire for destruction and chaos. This can take the form of a roaming gang of thugs who loot, fight, and drink for its own sake. They make trouble wherever they go and aren't tied down to any one place. Red is expression, and if that expression leans into violence, not for any purpose but merely for its own enjoyment, then you will have a faction on your hands that is unpredictable, aggressive. If you want to take it another step further, perhaps it's a faction full of murderers and arsons who leave blood and ash in their wake. The goal of any faction is important, and while most have some grander plan, this just isn't the case with this version, or with Red in general. The acts they commit are their own validation, and nothing more. When building an evil Red faction, I want you to dig down deep into the darker expressions of humanity to find what lies within. Our final color we'll cover is green. So let's begin with the altruistic version first. I want to start off with the goals of this faction right away, as I believe it will set the tone going forward. On one side, we have a version of green factions whose goal is to maintain balance, and in many ways might be the only neutral faction we discuss here today. Another goal would place them as staunch protectors of a given way of life, or piece of land, or important artifact. Let's discuss the first goal though. Green believes that everything is as it should be, and those who would upset this balance for their own gain would be enemies of green. The neutrality comes in when they see some actions as being part of that balance, and would at times allow events to happen which might harm others because balance must be maintained. Now, the other goal breeds a faction who sticks together for the purpose of protecting something which lends some significance to the world around them. It could be an important place, like a world tree, or an item which would be used for evil in the wrong hands. What we can see from both examples is that a green faction is less about overt action and more about protection and balance. Key features you should keep in mind when using this color to build your faction. So what happens when this takes a dark turn? For one, we know that green despises what it deems unnatural. To this end, a green faction could indeed push this too far and decide that those who take from the world, no matter their intentions, deserve to die. They could see the cities encroaching on their forests as an act of aggression and take that anger out on an undeserved population, becoming eco-terrorists who feel their actions are justified. In another way, they could see progress as stepping away from what nature intended and make it their goal to return the world to its original state, a motivation whose goal is a violent reset and rebellion against progress. Unfortunately, green can be blinded by the old ways, or of what it believes the world should be, and any act of changing that ideal world, in their eyes, is an affront to the perfect balance of nature, a balance they will restore through violence. In a lot of ways, the goals between a good green faction and an evil one is very similar. It's just that the evil one will take things much too far, in that the good green faction can accept the change in others, while the evil one demands that change not take place. In its protective and traditional nature, green can be xenophobic, and in turn think that any outsider deserves no kindness, and in many cases, worse than that. When building evil green factions, I want you to think of all that is good about green: traditionalism, balance, and acceptance, and then turn it on its head, becoming traditionality or death, balance at any cost, and defiance of anything that does not fit into their idea of what the world should be. As you can see, there is a change that happens when you apply the color pie to a group or faction. What was once a philosophy for an individual to live by now becomes an ideal for a group to strive for. And that's the key here. When you build your factions, keep its goal in front of mind. You see, when you bring people together, there must be a goal or an ideal to strive for, which will tie them to each other. At first, I want you to build monocolor factions to test your understanding of this new way to look at the color pie. And then, as you gain confidence, you can start to bring more colors together, which will in turn create more nuanced factions. Once you have a good understanding and are confident in your ability to build these factions, you can then move on to this system that will help spice up faction building for those experienced DMs out there that wish to challenge and surprise themselves. Let's say you have created your world and now you want to populate it with convincing factions. To do this, set out the number of factions you want to create. Let's say in your world there are 5 warring clans spread across a given province. For each of the 5 clans you wish to create, you would roll a d10 and note the colors that you were given. Each number will represent a version of each color. For instance, 1 would be a good white faction, 2 would result in an evil white faction, 3 a good blue faction, and so on, with the even numbers being evil and the odd numbers being good. Do this twice per faction and then challenge yourself to flesh out each one. One thing you might notice right away is that for some of them, you will roll both a good and evil version of a color. And honestly, this is where it gets interesting. For instance, you may have rolled a 4 and a 7 on one of your clans, which would result in an evil blue and a good red. Now your challenge becomes finding that gray area, not just between the colors, but between the good and evil goal. Like I said before though, I would start out with monocolor factions until you're confident with the system. Then build on that complexity with 2 and 3 colors. With this system, even a seasoned DM will find renewed excitement in world building, and can come to each session providing something that even they didn't expect. The color pie is a great guide for building characters, factions, and as we'll come to learn in the future, so much more. Use it to frame your world building, and in turn, you will craft better factions because of it. Well, my hope from that video is that you are now inspired to create your very own interesting and dynamic factions for your creative writing and Dungeons and Dragons. Once again, special thank you to my patrons. It means a lot to me that you guys support me on that level. If you want to become a patron and support this channel while getting perks, you can go down into the description and there'll be everything you need down there. You'll also find links to my Twitter and my Discord, so be sure to join up and continue the conversation there. And with that, I'll catch you in the multiverse. Bye.